Hi, this is Sam Mustafa, and welcome back to the introduction of the newest honor game, SCOURGE of Princes. This is the third short video in the series in which we look at how to resolve combat. As with the first two videos, you should download a copy of the Great Captain PDF from the Honor website. It'll be helpful to have it on your screen or in front of you as we go through these examples. Let's review a few points about charging the enemy, which we covered briefly in the first video because the charge itself is part of movement. A charge is a specific sort of movement. When you activate a unit to move, you must declare if it's going to charge the enemy. In the basic game, a charge is always a difficult move, meaning that it increases the momentum cost for the move. And it can't be done by a unit that is harassed, i.e. has a harassed marker. A charge can either be driven home or it is half-hearted. There are two ways to drive home a charge and thus get the full effect of your unit in the combat. You can aim your charging unit's front center point directly at the target of the charge. Look at the leftmost example. The blue unit is driving home a charge against the white unit. You can see the red and yellow arrow as its front center point aims directly at some point on the target. The other way to drive home a charge is if at least 3 of the defender's center points are directly to your front at the moment of contact. This is often the case when a big unit charges a small one. For example, the middle example, that blue unit is charging the white artillery unit. The center point of blue is not facing the white unit because the white unit is simply too small. But 3 of almost 4 of white's center points are directly to the front of blue, and so that charge is driven home. If neither of those conditions apply, the charge is called half-hearted, and the attacker will suffer some penalties in combat. Finally, it's very important to remember that you always resolve the combat immediately after the unit charges. In other words, a unit charges, you resolve that combat, and then you can activate another unit if you want. Note also that it's possible to charge more than one defender simultaneously. In that case, you'll resolve multiple combats, and we'll discuss that in a few minutes. Combats, therefore, can happen at several points during your round. Let's start with a simple example to introduce the basic mechanism for resolving combat. A unit of Swiss pikemen, there in white, has charged a unit of German Landsknechte in blue. Both units are fresh, meaning they haven't taken enough disruptions yet to affect their combat performance. If you need to review the rules for disruption, watch video number 2. Both of these units have the pike trait, which will become important in a moment. This combat is a simple frontal charge, a classic push of pike. Nobody has been flanked, nobody's in difficult terrain. We begin with the combat values of each unit. That's the white number in the blue square. That's the basic number of dice the unit rolls in combat. The pike trait has 2 functions. It helps defend infantry units from enemy cavalry by forcing that cavalry to re-roll their successful combat dice. But in this case, we're interested in the pike trait's effect in combat against enemy infantry, and that is, a pike unit gets a bonus die in combat against enemy infantry. So our Swiss, with a combat value of 7, will actually roll 8 dice, and the Landsknechte will roll 6 plus 1 equals 7 dice for them. Fresh units score successes on rolls of 3 or higher unless they're in difficult terrain. And nobody in our example is in difficult terrain, so let's roll the dice, and we see here what we've got. The Swiss scored 5 successes. The Landsknechte scored 4. The Swiss have won the combat. There are 2 ways to win. If you score more successes than your enemy, you have bested him, and that's what happened here. If you score double or more the number the enemy scored, then you have defeated him. In this case, the Swiss have bested the Landsknechte. When the attacker wins the combat, we find the result on the combat outcome matrix. The victorious attacker is shown in red, the defender who lost the combat is shown in blue. Cross-index the unit types involved. In our case, this is simple. It's a symmetrical combat, ranked infantry versus ranked infantry. I've drawn a yellow circle around the panel of the outcome matrix that we need to look at. That panel shows either 1 or 2 outcomes. If it shows 2, the one on top is for when you've bested the defender, and the one on the bottom is for when you've defeated him. In many cases, as you can see, there's only a single result whether you best or defeat the defender. In our case, it means the Landsknechte suffer 2 disruptions. The result on the matrix is the result for the defender who lost the combat. But combat disrupts everybody, even the winner, so the Swiss take 1 disruption unless doing so would break them. The defender was bested, but is still holding their ground. They haven't broken, so the Swiss must stagger. That is a 1-inch fall-back move directly backward, i.e. into the space that you just attacked from, and the combat is now over. If the matrix looks a bit complex to you, let's take a moment to understand what it does. Combat in this era can be very asymmetrical. Loose order cavalry behaves very differently from ranked infantry, or from anybody else for that matter. It is possible for infantry to attack cavalry, in which case the cavalry's reaction is very different than when it's attacked by enemy cavalry, and so on. The matrix allows us to use a very simple combat mechanism, but then to fine-tune the outcome according to who is fighting whom. Did you notice, for example, that in our ranked infantry versus ranked infantry combat just now, there's no chance to break the defender. The worst that can happen to him when he's defeated is 3 disruptions. Now, 3 disruptions is pretty bad, and a couple rounds of that sort of drubbing will break just about anybody. But this guarantees that infantry combat is attritional. The game forces you to get stuck in for a while, during which the bigger units have an inherent advantage over the smaller ones because they can take a lot more punishment, more disruptions. Look at how different cavalry combats are. A ranked cavalry unit that wins against loose order infantry, for example, even if it only bests the defender, breaks them instantly. Those armored knights have scattered the peasants. By putting all of these details on the matrix, we get it out of the way of the game process, and you don't need a million special rules and exceptions and traits and rerolls and modifiers and so on. Now let's do a more complex combat. This time, loose order cavalry, some stradioti from my Venetian army, seen here in green, have embarrassed John's cuirassiers, these are ranked cavalry, by charging them in their flank. If your front center point and at least 2 of your corners are behind the enemy's front edge, then you flanked him, which I've done here. Being flanked means that John's cuirassiers will have to re-roll all of their successes in combat. In Scourge of Princes, all re-rolls, no matter what for, succeed on a 4 or better. These cuirassiers are fresh, meaning that they'll roll their 8 dice, looking for 3s and better, but then they'll have to re-roll all of those successes, this time hoping for 4s and better. Not good. The other issue with being flanked is that it makes you vulnerable. A vulnerable unit that loses a combat, even by a difference of only 1, is broken. So John's cuirassiers are really fighting for their lives here. Luckily for them, my stradioti have a combat value of only 4. They're not really battle cavalry, they're just cheeky skirmishers who are getting very bold. There's one more thing to consider in a cavalry versus cavalry fight, the issue of cavalry doctrine. Now, this doesn't apply here, but let's review the rule anyway. Because this game covers over 150 years of history, tactics and organization changed a lot, and the more modern types of cavalry have advantages over the older types. This only applies to ranked cavalry fighting other ranked cavalry, so it's not going to matter for us. My stradioti can't even pronounce the word doctrine, much less apply it. So John rolls his 8 dice, and he scores 5 successes. but he must re-roll them. And let's imagine that after doing so, only 3 are still successes. So his combat score is 3. He's really sweating it now. But my stratioti just aren't up to the task. They score only 2 successes. The cuirassiers have won the combat 3-2. When the defender wins, we don't bother with the combat outcome matrix. The result is always the same. The defender takes 1 disruption, unless doing so would break them, and the attacker takes 2, which might break them. And if they're still alive after that, they must stagger. So the stratioti have been chastened and they are now worn. A small unit with 2 disruptions is now worn. The cuirassiers are merely embarrassed. What would have happened if the combat scores had been tied? In such a case, the combat is called a desultory affair. It results in no losses to either side, and the attacker staggers. Let's do one more example, this time quite complex. This medium-sized Spanish tercio, ranked infantry in green, has charged the Turkish artillery unit and a unit of Ottoman provincial troops, those are loose order infantry. Note a couple of important points. Both of the infantry units are at least partially on rocky ground. That's difficult terrain for the ranked infantry, but not for the Turks, who are loose order. Secondly, those Spanish are making a half-hearted attack against the provincials, putting them at a further disadvantage. When you charge more than 1 defender simultaneously, you must resolve a separate combat against each of them. You must prioritize defenders against whom you've driven home the charge. Charges that are driven home must be resolved before any half-hearted charges. So the first combat here is the hopeless fight of the Turkish gunners versus the Spanish infantry. You can see the Turks roll only 2 dice. They are fresh. They need 3s and better to succeed. The Spanish have a combat value of 7. Now, they don't get a bonus for their pikes, since that only applies against enemy infantry. And they don't get the bonus for outnumbering the enemy, since that only applies when you're fighting a 1 versus 1 combat. So they roll their 7 dice. They're a fresh unit in difficult terrain, so they need 4s or better to succeed. Even with their disadvantages, the Spanish have no trouble winning, 4 successes against 2. The attacker has won the combat, so we look at the outcomes matrix. Notice that artillery units are vehicles, and any attacker that wins a combat against a vehicle, whether by just 1 or by defeating him, by any margin, breaks that vehicle. So the artillery unit has been broken. In a multi-defender situation like this, the attacker doesn't take any losses until it either must stagger from a combat or all the defenders have broken. So we don't apply any disruptions to the Spanish yet. Instead, now we turn to the attack against the provincial infantry. This is now a 1 versus 1 fight. The Turks have 5 dice, they are fresh, and they're untroubled by the rocky ground, being loose order infantry, so they succeed on rolls of 3 or better. The Spanish start with 7 dice, but they get an extra die for their pike trait, fighting against enemy infantry. Normally, a medium-sized unit attacking a small unit would get a bonus for outnumbering in a 1 versus 1 combat like this because the artillery is dead. But that bonus only applies when you drive home a charge. You don't get it for a half-hearted charge. So the Spanish roll 7 plus 1 equals 8 dice. They are in difficult terrain for them, which normally means they succeed on a 4 or better, but this is a half-hearted charge, which must shift down to the next lower row, and thus the Spanish will need rolls of 5 or better to succeed. Whose idea was this attack anyway? Wow, it turns out Loyola was right. God is clearly a Spaniard. The Spanish scored 4 successes. The Turks only scored 2. The Spanish have defeated the Turks. They've scored double or more the number of successes. The outcome matrix shows this means the Turks are broken. The Spaniards now take their 1 disruption and they hold their position. There is an additional possible combat outcome unique to defending cavalry units. Typically, when they lose a combat, they take some number of disruptions and then they scatter. A scattered unit is removed from the table and placed in its side's reinforcement area. Any disruptions it suffers go with it. Then, in its side's next round, it reappears as a reinforcement within 8 inches of its army's baggage unit. In other words, the cavalry lost the combat, fled, and then rallied in the rear of the army. There's a lot more that we could say about combat. For example, there are entrenchments called fieldworks that have an effect upon both sides. In the 17th century, there are dragoon units that can choose whether they're moving and fighting as infantry or as cavalry. There's a special consideration for infantry being vulnerable when it attacks cavalry under certain circumstances. There's the eagle or hedgehog formation that ranked infantry units can adopt, which makes them immobile but no longer vulnerable when flanked. The advanced rules get into things like the use of commanded shot to support cavalry. There's the possibility of 2 hated or inspired opponents fighting each other more than once in a round. There are bodyguard units. There are small storming parties of light infantry called avant-gardes that can infiltrate large enemy units in any terrain. There is impetuous cavalry. On the other hand, cavalry that prefers to caracole, i.e. softening up the enemy with pistol fire before charging, if they even get around to charging. But you can read about all of that in the book. This video has given you the basics for the most common sorts of combats and hopefully will help you get started. It's now time for you to read the Scourge of Prince's rulebook. Set up your first game using the Encounter at Trovieto introductory scenario. I hope you have a great game. Let me know about it online.